The court system of the Qing dynasty was defined by rigid hierarchies, codified ritual, and a deeply embedded structure of imperial authority that extended into every aspect of palace life. Within this system, concubines occupied a formally recognized yet precarious position, situated between privilege and constraint. Their presence was not incidental but institutional, governed by regulations that reflected both Confucian ideals and the political priorities of imperial rule. Historical records indicate that the imperial harem was not merely a domestic space, but a carefully managed political environment. The selection of concubines was conducted through formalized processes, often involving banner families tied to the Manchu ruling elite. Surviving documents suggest that candidates were chosen not solely for physical appearance, but also for family background, moral reputation, and perceived suitability to court discipline. These selections were overseen by officials who ensured adherence to established criteria, reinforcing the state's control over even the most intimate aspects of the emperor's life. Once admitted into the palace, concubines entered a system structured by rank. The hierarchy ranged from the empress at the apex to various grades of consorts and lower-ranking attendants. Legal codes of the period reveal that each rank carried specific privileges, stipends, and responsibilities, as well as strict limitations. Movement within the palace was regulated, access to the emperor was controlled, and interactions between ranks were governed by elaborate etiquette. The hierarchy was not static. Promotions and demotions occurred, often reflecting shifts in imperial favor or broader political considerations. Contemporary accounts describe the palace as an environment of intense regulation, where daily routines were dictated by protocol. Concubines were expected to adhere to strict schedules, participate in ritual observances, and maintain conduct that aligned with Confucian expectations of obedience and decorum. Deviation from these norms could result in disciplinary measures, ranging from loss of status to confinement. Chroniclers noted that even minor infractions were documented, reflecting a broader culture of surveillance within the court. The physical setting of the imperial harem further reinforced this system of control. The Forbidden City, which served as the primary residence of the emperor and his household, was designed to regulate movement and visibility. Architectural divisions separated different groups within the palace, limiting contact and ensuring that interactions occurred within prescribed boundaries. Gates, corridors, and courtyards functioned not only as spatial features, but also as mechanisms of governance, shaping the daily experiences of those who lived within them. Surviving documents suggest that concubines' lives were characterized by a combination of privilege and restriction. On one hand, they had access to material comforts, including clothing, food, and housing that reflected their rank. On the other hand, their autonomy was significantly limited. They could not leave the palace without authorization, and their communication with the outside world was tightly controlled. Family visits were rare and subject to approval, reinforcing the separation between concubines and their previous lives. The relationship between concubines and the emperor was central to their position, yet it was also mediated by institutional constraints. Access to the emperor was regulated through a system that determined which women could be summoned and when. Historical records indicate that eunuchs played a key role in this process, acting as intermediaries who managed schedules and enforced protocol. This system ensured that personal relationships were subordinated to the needs of the court, reducing the potential for informal influence. Eunuchs themselves were an integral part of the palace structure, functioning as administrators, attendants, and enforcers of discipline. Contemporary accounts describe their role in maintaining order within the harem, including overseeing daily routines and reporting on behavior. Their position, while subordinate to the emperor, granted them a degree of authority over concubines, particularly those of lower rank. This dynamic contributed to a complex network of power relations within the palace, where authority was distributed across multiple layers. Legal codes of the period reveal that concubines were subject to specific regulations regarding conduct, inheritance, and status. For example, the status of a concubine's child was determined by both the mother's rank and the emperor's recognition. Sons born to higher-ranking consorts had greater prospects within the imperial succession, while those of lower-ranking women faced more limited opportunities. This system reinforced the importance of rank within the harem, as it directly influenced the future of both mothers and their children. The potential for advancement within the hierarchy created an environment in which favor and recognition were highly significant. Surviving documents suggest that concubines could be promoted based on various factors, including the birth of a son, demonstrated virtue, or the emperor's personal preference. However, these promotions were not solely personal decisions. They were often influenced by court politics, including the interests of influential families and officials. As a result, the lives of concubines were closely tied to broader political dynamics. At the same time, the system imposed clear limitations on ambition. Chroniclers noted that overt attempts to gain influence could be met with suspicion or punishment, reflecting a broader concern with maintaining stability within the court. The regulation of behavior extended to speech, dress, and even emotional expression, all of which were expected to conform to established norms. This emphasis on control was consistent with the Qing court's broader approach to governance, which prioritized order and hierarchy. The consequences of falling out of favor could be severe. Historical records indicate that demotion, isolation, or reassignment to less desirable quarters were common outcomes for those who lost status. In more serious cases, accusations of misconduct could lead to formal investigation and punishment. These measures were intended not only to address individual cases, but also to reinforce the authority of the system as a whole. Despite these constraints, surviving documents suggest that concubines were not entirely without agency. They could form alliances, cultivate relationships with influential figures, and navigate the complexities of court life in ways that advanced their position. However, such actions were always bounded by the structural limitations of the system, which constrained the range of possible outcomes. The treatment of concubines under the Qing court system thus reflects a broader pattern of governance in which personal lives were integrated into the machinery of the state. The combination of hierarchy, regulation, and surveillance created an environment that was both controlled and dynamic, shaped by the interplay of individual actions and institutional structures. Within this controlled environment, the internal dynamics of the imperial harem developed into a system of layered authority that extended beyond formal rank. Surviving documents suggest that while the hierarchy established clear lines of status, daily influence often depended on proximity to power, access to information, and the ability to navigate relationships with key figures such as senior consorts and palace administrators. The result was a structure in which formal titles coexisted with informal networks, each shaping the lived realities of concubines in different ways. Contemporary accounts describe how senior-ranking women, particularly those holding titles just below the empress, exercised a degree of supervisory authority over lower-ranking concubines. This authority was not merely symbolic. It included responsibilities for maintaining discipline, organizing ritual observances, and ensuring adherence to court protocol. Chroniclers noted that these senior figures could recommend promotions or report misconduct, effectively acting as intermediaries between the emperor and the broader harem population. Their role reinforced the hierarchical order while also creating an additional layer of oversight that extended into daily life. At the center of this structure stood the empress, whose authority was both ceremonial and administrative. Legal codes of the period reveal that the empress was responsible for the overall management of the inner court, including the conduct of concubines and the organization of rituals tied to imperial legitimacy. Her position reflected Confucian ideals of order within the household, scaled to the level of the empire itself. However, surviving documents suggest that the effectiveness of an empress's authority varied depending on her relationship with the emperor and the broader political context of the court. The presence of powerful dowager empresses further complicated this structure. The influence of figures such as Empress Dowager Cixi illustrates how authority within the harem could extend into the highest levels of state governance. Historical records indicate that Cixi's position allowed her to shape court decisions, control access to the emperor, and influence the appointment and treatment of concubines. Her role demonstrates that the inner court was not isolated from political power, but was instead deeply integrated into the mechanisms of imperial rule. Within this environment, the daily lives of concubines were shaped by routines that emphasized both discipline and visibility. Contemporary accounts describe how appearances at court rituals, seasonal ceremonies, and formal gatherings were opportunities to demonstrate compliance with expected norms. Dress, posture, and demeanor were all subject to scrutiny, reflecting a broader emphasis on maintaining the dignity of the imperial household. Failure to meet these expectations could be interpreted as a breach of protocol, with consequences that extended beyond the individual to the reputation of the harem as a whole. At the same time, the controlled nature of these interactions limited opportunities for genuine social mobility. Surviving documents suggest that while promotions were possible, they were relatively rare and often tied to specific events such as childbirth. The birth of a son, in particular, could significantly alter a concubine's position, as it directly affected questions of succession. However, even in such cases, the benefits were not guaranteed. The status of the child depended on recognition by the emperor and acceptance within the broader court hierarchy, both of which could be influenced by political considerations. The issue of succession was a central concern within the Qing court, and the role of concubines in producing heirs placed them at the intersection of personal and political interests. Legal codes of the period reveal that the designation of an heir was not solely a matter of birth order, but involved a complex evaluation of lineage, maternal status, and imperial preference. This process created an environment in which the fortunes of concubines were closely tied to the perceived value of their offspring, reinforcing the importance of reproductive roles within the system. Eunuchs continued to play a critical role in managing these dynamics. Contemporary accounts describe how they controlled access to information, regulated communication between different parts of the palace, and enforced the schedules that governed daily life. Their position allowed them to influence the flow of requests, reports, and recommendations, giving them a degree of informal power that could affect the treatment of concubines. While they remained subordinate within the official hierarchy, their practical authority within the inner court was widely acknowledged. The system also extended into matters of health and well-being. Surviving documents suggest that medical care within the palace was organized through official channels, with court physicians assigned to attend to members of the imperial household. However, access to these services was influenced by rank, with higher-ranking consorts receiving more consistent attention. This disparity reflects the broader pattern of resource distribution within the harem, where privilege was closely tied to status and favor. Isolation from the outside world remained a defining feature of concubines' lives. Historical records indicate that communication with family members was highly restricted, often limited to formal occasions or mediated through official channels. This separation reinforced the self-contained nature of the palace, where identities were reshaped to align with the expectations of the court. For many concubines, entry into the harem marked a permanent transition, with limited opportunity to return to their previous social environments. Disciplinary practices within the harem were designed to maintain order while reinforcing the authority of the system. Legal codes of the period outline a range of penalties for misconduct, including demotion, fines, and confinement. In more serious cases, accusations could lead to formal investigations conducted by court officials. Contemporary accounts suggest that these processes were intended not only to address individual behavior, but also to serve as a deterrent, emphasizing the consequences of deviation from established norms. At the same time, the potential for accusation created an atmosphere of caution within the harem. Chroniclers noted that disputes between concubines could escalate into formal complaints, with outcomes that depended on both evidence and the relative status of those involved. This dynamic contributed to a climate in which alliances were carefully managed, and conflicts were often shaped by broader considerations of rank and influence. Despite these constraints, evidence suggests that concubines engaged in forms of cultural and intellectual activity within the palace. Some were educated in literature, calligraphy, and the arts, reflecting the court's emphasis on refinement and moral cultivation. These pursuits were not merely personal interests, but were integrated into the broader expectations of conduct, serving as indicators of virtue and discipline. Participation in such activities could enhance a concubine's reputation, although it did not fundamentally alter the structural limitations of her position. The treatment of concubines under the Qing court system thus reveals a complex interplay between regulation and adaptation. While the formal hierarchy and legal framework imposed clear boundaries, the daily realities of palace life were shaped by negotiation within those constraints. Authority was exercised through both official channels and informal relationships, creating a system that was simultaneously rigid and responsive to internal dynamics. Over time, these structures contributed to the stability of the imperial household, ensuring that roles were clearly defined and that behavior was aligned with the expectations of the state. At the same time, they imposed significant limitations on individual autonomy, reflecting a broader pattern in which personal lives were subordinated to the needs of governance. The experiences of concubines within this system provide insight into the ways in which power was organized and maintained within one of the most tightly controlled environments of imperial China. In the later phases of the Qing dynasty, the internal structure of the imperial harem remained formally intact while increasingly existing within a changing political landscape. Historical records indicate that although the institutional hierarchy governing concubines continued to operate according to established codes, the broader stability that had sustained the system for centuries began to weaken under the pressures of internal reform, external conflict, and administrative strain. Contemporary accounts describe how the late 19th century introduced significant disruptions to court life. The imperial household remained bound by ritual and protocol, yet the conditions surrounding it were no longer stable in the same way as earlier periods. Financial constraints, political fragmentation, and repeated crises affected the resources available to the palace, altering the material conditions under which concubines lived. Surviving documents suggest that while the formal ranks and titles persisted, their practical implications were increasingly shaped by the broader instability of the state. The role of the emperor during this period also shifted in ways that affected the inner court. The reign of the Guangxu emperor is often cited in historical scholarship as a period in which reformist pressures intersected with entrenched court authority. Legal and administrative changes introduced during the late Qing reforms were primarily directed at state institutions, but they indirectly influenced the palace system by altering the distribution of power and resources. Within this context, concubines continued to occupy defined ranks, yet the political meaning of those ranks was increasingly unstable. Chroniclers noted that the influence of senior court figures, including the imperial household administration, remained significant in regulating access and maintaining order. However, the authority of the inner court was no longer insulated from external political intervention. The increasing involvement of state factions in court affairs meant that decisions affecting concubines could be influenced by broader political struggles, rather than solely by internal palace hierarchy. This shift marked a gradual erosion of the relative autonomy that the imperial harem had previously maintained. The prominence of Empress Dowager Cixi during this period further illustrates the consolidation of power within a limited number of figures at the center of the court. Historical records indicate that her control over court appointments, ceremonial authority, and access to the emperor allowed her to exert influence over the composition and organization of the inner palace. While the formal structure of concubinage remained unchanged, the practical administration of the system increasingly reflected the priorities of dominant political actors rather than a balanced institutional hierarchy. At the level of daily life, concubines continued to operate within the established routines of ritual observance and regulated conduct. However, surviving documents suggest that the symbolic function of these rituals became more pronounced as the political authority of the dynasty came under strain. Ceremonial life persisted as a means of reinforcing legitimacy, yet its relationship to effective governance grew more distant. Within this environment, concubines remained participants in a system that was increasingly defined by its adherence to tradition rather than its political centrality. The late Qing period also saw heightened exposure to external pressures that affected the imperial household indirectly. Diplomatic conflicts, military defeats, and internal uprisings contributed to a broader environment of uncertainty. Historical accounts indicate that during moments of crisis, the palace often responded by reinforcing ritual discipline and tightening internal controls. For concubines, this meant continued adherence to strict behavioral codes, even as the external conditions sustaining those codes were becoming less stable. The aftermath of the Xinhai Revolution marked the decisive structural transformation of the imperial system. Historical records indicate that the abdication of the last emperor brought an end to the dynastic framework that had defined the political and social organization of the court. With the collapse of imperial authority, the institutional basis for the harem system was formally dissolved, ending the legal and administrative structures that had governed concubines for centuries. Following the transition to the early Republic period, the former members of the imperial household experienced a redefinition of their legal and social status. Surviving documents suggest that while some individuals were permitted to remain within the former palace complex under negotiated arrangements, the institutional hierarchy that had once structured their lives no longer existed in an official capacity. Titles that had previously carried specific legal meaning were stripped of their administrative function, reducing them to historical designations rather than operative ranks. The dissolution of the harem system did not immediately erase the social realities shaped by it. Historical accounts indicate that many former concubines faced significant challenges in adapting to life outside the imperial framework. Their identities, which had been constructed within a highly regulated environment, no longer corresponded to a functioning institutional structure. While some retained access to limited resources or informal support networks, the broader system of protection and hierarchy that had defined their existence was no longer present. Within this transition, the broader significance of the concubine system has been interpreted in historical scholarship as part of the administrative logic of imperial governance. Legal codes of the period reveal that the structure of the harem was not an isolated cultural phenomenon, but an integrated component of state organization. It reflected broader principles of hierarchy, control, and ritual order that extended throughout the imperial system. The regulation of concubines was therefore closely aligned with the governance strategies applied across other domains of Qing administration. Contemporary analysis of surviving records suggests that the endurance of the system over multiple centuries was closely tied to its flexibility within rigid boundaries. While the hierarchy remained formally stable, its internal dynamics allowed for variation in influence, favor, and lived experience. This combination of strict structure and adaptable practice contributed to its longevity, even as broader political conditions evolved. At the same time, the system imposed enduring constraints on individual autonomy. The lives of concubines were shaped by institutional mechanisms that regulated movement, communication, and status in ways that limited personal independence. These constraints were not incidental but fundamental to the operation of the court, reflecting a governance model in which private life was systematically integrated into public authority.